I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grunberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in 4 days, on the 19th of August, we will commemorate World Humanitarian Day, a day dedicated to honoring those who tirelessly serve people in need around the world, including in Yemen. Yet, in Yemen, we are facing a clampdown by Ansar Allah on the humanitarian and civic space. It has been almost 80 days since Ansar Allah started its concerted campaign detaining Yemeni employees of the UN, civil society, national and international NGOs, diplomatic missions, and private sector entities. Dozens of men and women, among which 13 UN personnel, including one of my own staff members, are still being detained in unknown locations. These detentions are in addition to OHCHR and UNESCO staff who have been detained by Ansar Allah since 2021 and 2023, respectively. In addition, on the 29th of July, Ansar Allah closed the OHCHR office in Sana'a and asked its international staff to leave. Following the closure, Ansar Allah security forces, in a flagrant violation of the UN privileges and immunities, stormed the office on the 3rd of August. This is an ominous signal of the broader direction Ansar Allah is taking and represents a serious attack on the ability of the UN to perform its mandate. Protecting human rights is fundamentally about protecting the future of Yemen and the rights and freedoms of Yemenis. I therefore call on Ansar Allah to act responsibly and compassionately towards its fellow countrymen and women, and immediately and unconditionally release all UN, NGO, civil society, diplomatic mission, and private sector employees, as well as members of religious minorities, and refrain from further arbitrary detentions. Let them be reunited with their families. Let them go back to their jobs, serving Yemenis, providing humanitarian assistance, development assistance, peace building, human rights, mediation, and the protection of cultural heritage. Mr. President, the Middle East is currently holding its breath, and I sincerely hope that the escalatory trajectory that we have experienced in the past months can be reversed. What started in Israel and Gaza in October last year has drawn in several other countries, including Yemen. Despite serious efforts to shield Yemen from this regional escalation, Ansar Allah continues to attack ships in the Red Sea, and the US and the UK have continued their strikes on military targets in Ansar Allah-controlled territory. This situation, which has lasted for over 8 months now, is not sustainable. Mr. President, this regional escalation is taking place in parallel to real and urgent challenges inside Yemen that need to be addressed. Addressing the decade-long conflict in Yemen continues to be at the center of my work. It is a conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, has weakened Yemen's social fabric, and has undermined the delivery of public services. This has made Yemen more vulnerable to natural disasters and environmental hazards and diseases, as the recent floodings in Hodeidah, Marib, and Taiz, in addition to the continuing cholera outbreak, have demonstrated. Therefore, I once again call on the Yemeni parties, and Ansar Allah in particular, to prioritize the Yemenis. Your responsibility lies first and foremost with Yemen. We need to shift the focus back to Yemen and find solutions for Yemen's problems. Mr. President, over the past months, I have continuously expressed my deep concern about the trajectory of events in Yemen. Unfortunately, this regressive trend, illustrated by continuing military activities and escalatory rhetoric, has continued. While levels of violence along the front lines remain relatively contained compared to the period before the 2022 truce, we are continuing to witness military preparations and reinforcements accompanied by continuous threats of a return to war, with further reports of clashes in Al-Dale, Al-Hodeidah, Lahej, Marib, Sada, and Taiz. Once again, this serves as a stark reminder of how volatile the situation is along the Yemeni front lines. Mr. President, despite this bleak picture, last month, with the support of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the parties were able to halt a dangerous cycle of escalation that was negatively impacting Yemen's banking and transport sectors and threatened to ignite renewed military conflict. Since the announcement of the de-escalation understanding, which includes the functioning of Yemeniya Airlines and ensuring the continued access of Yemen's biggest banks to international banking services, we have seen some initial progress towards its implementation. However, the onus is now on the parties to not only act in good faith and fully implement the commitments they made, but also to transform the understanding into something that improves the lives and the livelihoods of all Yemenis. And with this, I again underscore the importance of working toward the unification of the currency, a unified central bank, and ensuring the banking sector is free from political interference. My office has prepared options and offered a clear proposal and pathway to achieve these objectives, all of which have been based on the input of the parties themselves. We continue to stand ready to support the parties to reach mutually acceptable solutions through dialogue for the benefit of all Yemenis. Mr. President, in December of last year, the parties agreed to a set of commitments. These commitments remain valid today, and despite the ever more complicated mediation space, I remain determined to keep all channels of communication open and to continue with our engagement at different levels on different issues. On the economy, on a nationwide ceasefire and other security arrangements, on a political process, and on the release of conflict-related detainees. In line with these efforts, last month, in partnership with UN Women, my office brought together 70 representatives of different segments of Yemeni society for its fourth consultation in Mukalla, Hadramaut, to continue the work to develop a vision for inclusive peace, elevating the voice of women. My office also visited Riyadh and Aden to continue engagements on a nationwide ceasefire and other security arrangements, including exploring ways to support de-escalation efforts in Yemen. In addition, since the conclusion of the meeting on conflict-related detainees in July, we have continued our engagements with the parties to build on the progress reached in Oman. Mr. President, we do all of this in order to keep the focus on the longer-term priorities of seeking a sustainable and just solution for the benefit of all Yemenis. I remain determined to achieve the task entrusted to me by this Council, to support the resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition. I continue to depend on the Council's full support for these efforts. Your consistent and unified messaging on the importance of a political process and a ceasefire, as well as your continued advocacy for the release of UN personnel, is all the more crucial during these turbulent times. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughton.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Special Envoy Grunberg for his update and for his unstinting efforts to bring about lasting peace in Yemen. Mr. President, let me start by again raising the continuing arbitrary detention by the Houthi de facto authorities of the United Nations personnel and dozens of international and national NGO staff and civil society representatives, among others. All of them are Yemeni men and women. They have now been held in detention for more than 2 months, in addition to the 4 United Nations personnel arbitrarily detained since 2021 and 2023. The United Nations continues efforts to secure their release, and we are in frequent contact with the Houthi de facto authorities and others toward this end. While a few families of the detained have been able to contact them, the vast majority have still not been afforded this opportunity. And it remains the case that neither United Nations nor legal representatives have been allowed to visit or communicate with the detained. This situation is completely unacceptable. I once again demand that the Houthi de facto authorities immediately release all of our colleagues held in detention. And I reiterate that while they are detained, they must be treated humanely and be allowed contact with family members and legal counsel in accordance with international norms. We will continue efforts to secure their release with determination until they are all freed. We urge all member states to exert any influence and leverage they have in support of these efforts. Mr. President, over recent weeks, we've seen a worrying deterioration in the operational environment in Houthi-controlled areas. The Houthi de facto authorities' recent closure of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a and the subsequent forced entry of the office compound and taking control of UN assets are wholly unacceptable. I join High Commissioner Turk in urging them to leave the premises immediately and return all equipment and assets. These events have occurred alongside other worrying measures that are negatively impacting our ability to sustain humanitarian operations. The environment in these areas is growing more constrained at a time when humanitarians are already struggling to meet the needs of millions of people across the country. The United Nations and our humanitarian partners are committed to staying and delivering for the people of Yemen, but minimum requirements must be met to ensure that UN personnel and other humanitarian workers can do so without having to compromise their safety and security. Mr. President, over the past 10 days, heavy rainfall and flash flooding hit several governorates in Yemen, damaging homes, farms, and public infrastructure. About 69,500 families have been directly affected, with many losing their homes and sources of livelihood. Some 98 people have been killed and more than 600 others injured. In response, humanitarian partners have provided immediate life-saving assistance, including food, water, hygiene kits, and shelter support to affected families. They also delivered critical medical supplies to local hospitals and health centers and deployed dozens of mobile health teams to affected areas. However, a lack of adequate funding continues to undermine these and other efforts to address the critical needs across Yemen. 8 months into the year, our targeted and prioritized humanitarian response plan for 2024 is only 27% funded, forcing humanitarians to make difficult decisions about which vulnerable families and communities would receive support. Mr. President, preventing the spread of cholera is one area in which additional funds are urgently needed. Although the UN-led multi-agency cholera response plan is currently 60% funded, this was based on an initial estimate of 60,000 cholera cases between April and September 2024. Regrettably, at the beginning of this month, the number of suspected cases across the country has swelled to more than 147,000, a substantial increase from that initial estimate. This means current funding is only sufficient to address a quarter of these cases, leaving a significant response gap, which our humanitarian partners have been struggling to fill. They've been doing their best to support treatment centers, providing them with medications, medical equipment, infection control supplies, and other resources. They're working to strengthen surveillance and response mechanisms to identify and address new cases quickly. And they've also been promoting prevention measures by improving access to safe water and sanitation services, distributing hygiene kits, and raising awareness in communities at risk. However, our health cluster colleagues warn that unless these response efforts are immediately bolstered, the number of suspected cases could further increase, potentially reaching more than 250,000 in just a few weeks. Additional funding is urgently needed to prevent this. Mr. President, food security in Yemen also continues to deteriorate. Inadequate food consumption has steadily increased, now affecting 60% of surveyed households nationwide. Vulnerable groups, in particular, women-headed households, report the most significant impact. Rates of severe food deprivation in areas controlled by the Houthi de facto authorities have more than doubled from 17% to 36% compared with the same time last year. They've also increased sharply in government-controlled areas and now stand at 32%. The impacts of increasing food insecurity and malnutrition extend far beyond hunger. They also expose children, especially girls, to increased rates of abuse and neglect. Today, an alarming 30% of girls in Yemen are forced into marriage before the age of 18 as families struggle to provide for them. And the number of children out of school, currently at a staggering 4.5 million, is likely to rise as more children are forced to leave school to help provide for their families. As we know, particularly for adolescent girls, this is not only jeopardizing their futures, but exposes them to greater risks of gender-based violence. To counter the impacts of the recent pause in general food distributions in Houthi-controlled areas, the World Food Programme is currently planning a one-off food distribution to more than 1.6 million people in the 34 worst affected districts. However, as the overall situation of food insecurity continues to deteriorate across the country, enhanced action will be needed to avert a further potential catastrophe. Full and urgent funding of the humanitarian response plan for Yemen is a minimum requirement for these and other critical humanitarian needs. Mr. President, the people of Yemen cannot afford the devastating toll of further conflict. Indeed, their ability to recover from the devastation of the conflict, address increasing humanitarian needs, and take concrete steps toward a more promising and stable future all depend on locking in progress on peace. I therefore echo the Secretary General's call for restraint and de-escalation, and I urge the Council to support peace in Yemen and the region. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Doughton, for your briefings and for the tireless work of your staff and other UN personnel in Yemen. President, the situation in Yemen is desperate, with devastating flooding coming on top of an already dire humanitarian crisis. And we express condolences to all those affected by the floods. The prospect of regional escalation threatens to further undermine security and stability. We urge all parties to de-escalate to avoid deepening the humanitarian crisis. The UK condemns the Houthis' reckless and escalatory attacks across the region in conjunction with other Iranian-linked groups. We also reiterate our call on the Houthis to cease their attacks in the Red Sea, which threaten international shipping. Recent reports have shown Houthi links to al-Shabaab. We firmly condemn these actions as part of a wider pattern of Houthi destabilizing activity beyond Yemen's borders. The relevant UN sanctions committees must coordinate closely to monitor and counter this worrying trend. President, the UK condemns the Houthis' closure of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a. The OHCHR presence is critical for the protection of civilians and reporting of human rights abuses. As we've heard, this follows the detention of UN, NGO and former diplomatic mission staff in June, and is yet another blatant aggression which will severely impede the delivery of vital aid to those most in need. These acts demonstrate once again the willingness of Houthi leaders to inflict harm and suffering on the Yemeni people to advance their own ambitions. It is the duty of this Council to ensure the Houthis guarantee a safe and unimpeded operational environment for humanitarian organisations. And we call on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release the detainees, leave the OHCHR premises, and return the assets they have seized. Finally, President, the Yemeni people deserve peace. Further escalation will only move us further away from achieving this. We urge restraint from all parties to preserve space for negotiations in line with the UN roadmap. And we call on this Council to remain unified in support of the Special Envoy's efforts to secure an inclusive and sustainable peace in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Признательный спецпосланнику генсекретаря по Йемену господину Хансу Грунбергу, а также директору отдела финансирования гуманитарной деятельности и мобилизации ресурсов УКГВ ООН госпоже Лизе Доутон за доклады. Ситуация в этой ближневосточной стране остается крайне непростой. Йеменское урегулирование уже более полугода балансирует на грани жизни и смерти. Несмотря на отсутствие масштабных боевых действий, неспокойно на линии соприкосновения. Локальные стычки происходят практически каждый день. Очевидно, что терпение сторон конфликта может иссякнуть в любой момент. В нынешних условиях даже крошечная искра может спровоцировать пожар, который будет крайне сложно потушить. Деградирующая региональная обстановка подтверждает острую необходимость как можно более срочного выхода на договоренности и закрытия йеменского досье. Иначе все усилия как самих йеменских сторон, так и международных и региональных посредников с апреля прошлого года будут сведены на нет. На этом фоне любые, даже незначительные шаги йеменских протагонистов навстречу друг другу приобретают особое значение. С удовлетворением отмечаем достигнутую между йеменскими сторонами договоренность о мерах по деэскалации в финансово-экономической сфере, а также возобновлении коммерческого авиасообщения с Саной. Приветствуем роль, которую сыграли в этом процессе страны региона. При этом оснований для беспокойства ситуация в Йемене дает более чем достаточно. Так, мы встревожены сообщениями о захвате 3 августа представителями Ансар Аллах странового офиса Управления Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека в Сане, конфискации части документов и транспортных средств. До сих пор не разрешилась ситуация с задержанными ранее 13 принятыми на месте сотрудниками ООН. Призываем как минимум обеспечить к ним немедленный гумдоступ. Действия, которые нарушают привилегии и иммунитеты структуры сотрудников Всемирной организации, недопустимы не только в Йемене, но и в любой другой стране. У Совета Безопасности ООН здесь не должно быть двойных стандартов. В этом контексте нельзя не напомнить о более 200 погибших в Газе сотрудников БАПОР и десятках разрушенных объектов агентства, а также тревожная информация о произвольных задержаниях бапоровцев израильскими силовыми структурами, применении к ним насилия и пыток. Рассчитываем, что те, кто сегодня критикует действия хуситов, будут также принципиальны и применительны к действиям Израиля. Господин председатель, с сожалением приходится констатировать неуклонно ухудшающуюся гуманитарную обстановку, а также продовольственные и энергетические кризисы в Йемене. 2/3 его населения, более 18 миллионов человек, требуется гумсодействие. Миллионы по-прежнему страдают от нехватки продовольствия. Гумплан ООН по Йемену на текущий год не профинансирован даже на четверть. Вдобавок ко всему, на эту многострадальную ближневосточную страну обрушились проливные дожди, вызвавшие разрушительные наводнения. Больше всего пострадали провинции Ходейда, Таиз и Мариб. Погибло как минимум 57 человек. Десятки тысяч семей вынуждены были покинуть места своего обитания. Окончательный ущерб еще только предстоит оценить. Как представляется, в нынешних условиях членам Совета и всему международному сообществу следует мобилизовать все доступные ресурсы для помощи простым йеменцам, борющимся за свою жизнь. Они должны иметь беспрепятственный доступ к еде, лекарствам и другим необходимым вещам, вне зависимости от географии проживания. Исходим из того, что единственным путем для достижения широкого национального согласия и выработки совместного видения будущего страны является запуск инклюзивного межйеменского диалога под эгидой ООН. Неизменно поддерживаем усилия спецпосланника Ханса Грюнберга, в том числе нацеленные на формальное закрепление устойчивого режима прекращения огня и запуск полноформатного инклюзивного национального диалога при поддержке ООН. Со своей стороны продолжаем координировать подходы со всеми ведущими политсилами в Йемене, а также региональными партнерами. Конечная цель – выход на долгосрочную стабилизацию. Вновь напоминаем о необходимости обновления международно-правовых основ урегулирования в Йемене. Господин председатель, думаю, мало кто сегодня решится отрицать, что общее неуклонное нарастание эскалации на Ближнем Востоке самым непосредственным образом сказывается на обстановке в Йемене. Страна, к сожалению, все больше вовлекается в региональную турбулентность. Нападения на коммерческие суда в Красном море по-прежнему представляют серьезную проблему. Призываем хуситов прекратить любые действия, препятствующие свободе международного судоходства, а также освободить судно Galaxy Leader и его экипаж. Одновременно требуем от всех международных игроков уважать суверенитет Йемена. Агрессивные действия в отношении объектов на территории этой страны, вроде ударов западной так называемой коалиции из акватории Красного моря, не просто грубо нарушают международное право, включая устав ООН, но и способствуют раскручиванию спирали эскалации с самыми непредсказуемыми последствиями. При этом очевидно, что действия Ансар Аллах не предпринимаются в вакууме. отражают степень накопленного в регионе раздражения политикой Израиля, в буквальном смысле пытающегося сравнять сектор Газа с землей, подвергая серьезнейшей угрозе жизни почти 2 миллионов его обитателей. И бездействие Совета Безопасности ООН лишь способствует подогреванию подобного настроя у арабской улицы, поддерживающей принципиальную линию хуситов. Июльское обострение в результате обмена ударами между ними и Израилем в очередной раз продемонстрировало, что нормализация как в ближневосточном регионе, так и в районе Красного моря невозможна без деэскалации в Газе. А она не может произойти без немедленного полноценного прекращения огня, добиться которого Совет Безопасности ООН не может вот уже 10 месяцев из-за произраильской линии Вашингтона. Коллеги, разорвать этот порочный круг могут только коллективные решительные действия, которые вернули бы ближневосточное урегулирование под эгиду ООН и в русло общеизвестной договорно-правовой базы, заданной решениями Совета Безопасности ООН. Все остальные мутные схемы, выгодные отдельным игрокам, но не дающие палестинцам то, что им давно положено по праву, лишь отдаляют нас от достижения устойчивого и справедливого мира в регионе. Давайте сосредоточимся, наконец, на этой неотложной задаче, решение которой значительно облегчит наши усилия по урегулированию других конфликтов, в том числе йеменского. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'envoyé spécial Hans Grunberg et Mme Lisa Doughton de OCHA pour leurs interventions. La guerre est laide, c'est par ces mots qu'Elham Hassan, 40 ans, habitante de Sanaa, commence sa lettre de septembre 2023 aux générations futures, un saisissant plaidoyer pour la paix. Elle ajoute, même lorsque les combats prennent fin, les choses ne redeviennent pas comme avant. Vous êtes peut-être encore en vie et vous respirez, mais vous ne vivez plus vraiment. Ces mots nous rappellent notre devoir, éviter les conflits et leurs lourdes conséquences. À ce titre, 3 points doivent être soulevés. Premièrement, il est urgent de mettre fin à la spirale de la violence. La Suisse reste très préoccupée par la situation dans la région, y compris au Yémen. Il faut éviter une escalade régionale encore plus grave. Celle-ci aurait aussi pour conséquence une aggravation de la situation au Yémen avec un coût humain désastreux. Nous appelons toutes les parties au strict respect du droit international, y inclus des droits et des libertés de navigation en mer Rouge. Nous réitérons notre appel à la plus grande retenue et à une solution diplomatique. La Suisse soutient tous les efforts diplomatiques actuellement en cours à cet égard. Deuxièmement, la résolution du conflit politique au Yémen doit rester au centre de notre attention. Nous appelons toutes les parties à tout faire pour éviter le retour d'un conflit à grande échelle. Favoriser toute mesure de renforcement de la confiance est primordial. Le mois dernier, nous avions salué l'accord concernant la cessation des mesures de rétorsion dans le secteur bancaire et la reprise de certains vols commerciaux. Sa mise en œuvre partielle est un pas dans la bonne direction. Toute mesure de rétorsion économique doit cesser. La Suisse appelle les parties au conflit à respecter les dispositions de l'accord de désescalade économique et à se réunir sous l'égide de l'Office de l'envoyé spécial. La reprise de discussions concernant un échange de prisonniers en juin dernier est un signal positif que nous saluons. Ces discussions représentent une opportunité pour créer un climat de confiance et redonner un élan aux pourparlers entamés par l'envoyé spécial. Dans ce contexte, la Suisse réitère son plein soutien au rôle de médiation de l'envoyé spécial. Troisièmement, seul un soutien au travail humanitaire et une résolution du conflit par la voie diplomatique permettront une amélioration pérenne de la situation humanitaire alarmante. Nous sommes préoccupés par les inondations soudaines. Une étude réalisée par une ONG yéménite à la demande de la Suisse sur l'impact du changement climatique sur les personnes déplacées au Yémen a montré que près de 600 000 personnes ont été déplacées au cours des 15 dernières années à cause des torrents et des crues soudaines. Ces inondations amplifient encore le risque des maladies telles que le choléra. Par ailleurs, la destruction des infrastructures civiles et la dispersion des populations en raison du conflit armé en cours ont encore accru la vulnérabilité à ces événements climatiques. Le travail du personnel humanitaire est crucial dans ce contexte. Leur sécurité et leur accès à la population civile doivent être garantis conformément au droit international humanitaire, comme le rappelle la résolution 2730. La Suisse est très préoccupée par les limitations de l'espace civil et humanitaire par les outils qui créent un climat de peur. La détention arbitraire des civils yéménites, y compris de membres de personnel humanitaire et onusiens, est inacceptable. La Suisse condamne la prise d'assaut du bureau du HCDH à Sanaa. Nous demandons la libération immédiate de toutes les personnes détenues arbitrairement. Pénétrer sans autorisation dans un bureau de l'ONU et s'emparer par la force des documents et des biens constitue une grave violation des privilèges et immunités des Nations Unies. Monsieur le Président, Ilham Hassan termine sa lettre avec un cri pressant, un appel pour une paix durable qui préservera la liberté, la dignité, les droits et l'égalité pour tous. Nous ne pouvons que réitérer cet appel pour le Yémen et pour l'ensemble de la région. Le soutien de ce Conseil pour les efforts des Nations Unies sur le plan politique et humanitaire reste fondamental. La Suisse continuera à œuvrer dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg and OCHA Director Doughton for their briefings. Given the heightened tensions in the region, it is essential for all parties to de-escalate hostilities and exercise restraints. The regional context is not conducive to efforts to address the dire situation in Yemen, including on the humanitarian front. More than 18 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, with more than half being children. Hunger continues to be a pressing concern, with 17.6 million people suffering acute food insecurity. Cholera continues to spread throughout Yemen, with nearly 150,000 suspected cases and hundreds of deaths. Recent flooding in Yemen has impacted tens of thousands of families, damaging homes, farms, and infrastructure, and resulting in the tragic death of many civilians. We call on the Yemeni authorities to remove obstacles to the delivery of aid and allow for safe, unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need throughout Yemen. The resource gap is of similar concern. We call on the international community to support a robust response to Yemen's humanitarian crisis and urgently scale up funding for Yemen's humanitarian response plan. Ensuring that our humanitarian colleagues have the appropriate operating environment to meet the needs of all Yemenis is key. In this vein, we strongly condemn the Houthis' arrests and arbitrary detentions of United Nations personnel, civil society, and staff working for non-governmental organizations and diplomatic missions in Yemen. These arrests are unacceptable and can have far-reaching ramifications on delivery of humanitarian aid. It is vital that humanitarian personnel are able to carry out their critical work in a safe operating environment. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. While in detention, they must be held in good conditions and allowed contact with their families, colleagues, and legal counsel. We strongly condemn the Houthi storming of the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Sana'a. This act is inconsistent with the privileges and immunities of the United Nations and constitutes a serious attack on the ability of the United Nations to perform its mandate. We call on the Houthis to leave the premises and return all seized assets and belongings immediately. President, the economic war that has been conducted by parties to the conflict has fragmented Yemen's economy and currency, causing inflation to rise and surging the prices of essential goods. We are encouraged by the agreements between the government of Yemen and the Houthis last month on several measures to de-escalate on the economic front. We hope this agreement can be used as a step forward towards establishing a formal nationwide ceasefire and resumption of an inclusive Yemeni-led and owned political process. We welcome excuse me. We welcome the efforts of the Office of the Special Envoy and UN Women in holding a fourth consultation with representatives of diverse segments of Yemeni society. The systematic violations of women's rights to freedom of movement limit women's ability to participate in all spheres, including work, education, and access healthcare. To ensure sustainable peace, women must be able to participate fully, equally, meaningfully, and safely in political negotiations and in decision-making for Yemen's future. In conclusion, Yemen is facing a critical juncture. Last month, we witnessed a new level of escalation, demonstrating the danger of a devastating region-wide conflict. The Houthis must immediately cease any military acts that could further jeopardize the safety of the millions of Yemenis who have suffered nearly a decade of war. This includes their actions against commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and the unjustifiable detention of the Galaxy leader and its crew. Members of the international community are also responsible to urgently de-escalate tensions in the region and prioritize dialogue to avoid further regional escalation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also want to thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Doughton for their briefings. I also want to welcome you.
A los llamados a la liberación inmediata e incondicional de los detenidos. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Director Doughton for their informative briefings. Yemen's trajectory is deeply worrying amid the continued turmoil both within and outside the country. While the whole region is in fragile situation, we should continue monitoring the situation in Yemen closely. Today, I wish to highlight 4 points. First, Japan strongly condemns the destabilizing actions by the Houthis, including their attacks against Israel and against commercial shipping in and around the Red Sea. The Houthis must cease their threats to peace and security in the region and beyond. Japan urges regional countries to exercise their influence to the Houthis and call for their restraint. We reiterate our demand that the Houthis to release the 25 crew members of the Galaxy leader who have been held for nearly 9 months without any further delay. Second, Japan is appalled by the storming of the OHCHR's office in Sana'a by the Houthis. This is yet another disrespectful act by the Houthis against the United Nations following the arbitrary detention of UN staffs 2 months ago. The Houthis must immediately leave OHCHR's premises and return all assets and belongings and unconditionally release all detained UN, NGO, and diplomatic mission personnel. We also demand that the Houthis never again conduct any such detentions or jeopardize the critical activities of the UN and other human rights and humanitarian workers who are there to serve the needs of the Yemeni people. Third, Japan is seriously concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen, where people are suffering from food insecurity, diseases, and natural disasters like the recent flooding and heavy rains. After 9 years of conflict, the need for basic social services such as healthcare, especially for women and girls, remains immense. With that in mind, Japan has recently contributed $2.4 million to UNFPA to strengthen life savings, reproductive health, and protection services. We will continue to provide necessary humanitarian assistance to alleviate the plight of Yemenis. Last but not least, Japan is deeply concerned about the stagnated peace process and growing insecurity in Yemen. We take positively the parties' agreement on several de-escalatory measures in the banking and aviation sectors last month, although many more critical problems remain. Only a comprehensive and sustainable national dialogue under UN auspices will bring political and economic stability and meet the legitimate aspirations of the Yemeni people who hope for peace and prosperity. Japan continues to support the critical mediation work of the Special Envoy towards this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie Hans Grünberg et Lisa Doughton de leurs exposés. Je voudrais également saluer la présence parmi nous du représentant permanent du Yémen. Monsieur le Président, face à la montée des tensions au Moyen-Orient, ce Conseil doit tout faire pour éviter un embrasement régional. Dans ce contexte, les Houthis doivent cesser immédiatement leurs activités déstabilisatrices dans la région, qui se poursuivent quotidiennement en violation des principes fondamentaux du droit international, comme le montre le rapport du SGNU. La France réitère sa condamnation très ferme de l'attaque de drones qui a ciblé Tel Aviv dans la nuit du 18 au 19 juillet, revendiquée par les Houthis. Il contribue à alimenter l'escalade régionale dans laquelle il porte une lourde responsabilité, y compris en mer Rouge et dans le golfe d'Aden, faisant fi des résolutions adoptées par ce Conseil. Ce Conseil a pourtant clairement condamné ces attaques, notamment en adoptant les résolutions 2722 et 2739. Les États ont le droit de défendre leurs navires contre ces attaques, en accord avec le droit international. Nous appelons les Houthis à y mettre un terme et à libérer immédiatement le Galaxy Leader et son équipage qui sont retenus depuis novembre 2023. La France appelle également l'Iran à cesser son soutien aux actions déstabilisatrices dans la région. La France réitère son attachement à la stabilité régionale et à la sécurité de ses partenaires dans la région. Elle poursuivra son engagement dans le cadre de l'opération européenne Aspides pour garantir la sûreté maritime et la liberté de navigation, conformément au droit international et en lien avec ses partenaires. Les Houthis sont aussi responsables de la dégradation de la situation humanitaire et des souffrances de la population yéménite, en raison des multiples entraves qu'ils imposent aux opérations humanitaires. Nous condamnons également l'assaut contre le bureau du HCDH par les Houthis et les détentions arbitraires de son personnel, de même que celles des ONG locales et internationales. Ces détentions sont contraires au droit international humanitaire. La France condamne fermement ces actes et exige leur libération immédiate. Ces arrestations sans fondement ont aussi des conséquences sur l'acheminement de l'aide et l'action des acteurs humanitaires, qui font déjà l'objet de nombreuses restrictions dans le territoire contrôlé par les Houthis, au détriment des populations civiles. Les Houthis doivent cesser de commettre des exactions contre leur propre population, qu'ils asphyxient économiquement et menacent quotidiennement. Il est inacceptable que les Nations unies soient contraintes de revoir leurs opérations et de limiter leurs actions pour faire face à ces menaces. Les personnels humanitaires doivent pouvoir mener leurs opérations de manière sûre et sans entrave. Les populations civiles dépendent de l'aide humanitaire. La France est préoccupée face aux inondations récentes, à l'insécurité alimentaire qui s'aggrave et à l'épidémie de choléra qui se propage, qui ont encore ajouté aux défis auxquels les Yéménites doivent répondre. Monsieur le Président, au plan sécuritaire, il faut parvenir à une cessation complète et durable des hostilités pour éviter toute reprise du conflit sur le terrain. Les Houthis doivent revenir à la table de négociation conduite par l'envoyé spécial, auquel la France apporte son plein soutien dans la mise en œuvre de sa feuille de route politique. La participation effective des femmes yéménites aux négociations doit être garantie. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢格伦德伯格特使和道顿司长的通报。我讲3点。第一，中方欢迎日前也门政府与胡塞武装就金融和航空问题达成协议，希望有关各方以此为例，从也门人民的利益和福祉出发，坚持政治解决大方向，排除干扰，相向而行，通过对话谈判化解矛盾，共同推进也人主导、也人所有的全面政治进程。中方支持格伦德伯格特使的斡旋努力，期待各方，特别是对也门局势有影响力的国家，为此发挥建设性作用。第二， 中方再次呼吁胡塞武装尊重各国商船根据国际法在红海水域的航行权利，停止有关袭扰行为，维护红海水域的航道安全。我们呼吁有关方面保持克制，停止加剧紧张局势的行为。第三，中方呼吁国际社会加大人道援助力度，加快兑现认捐承诺，帮助缓解也门严峻的人道局势。中方对联合国人员和资产在也门遭到扣押表示严重关切，呼吁立即无条件释放所有联合国人员，归还相关的财产。主席，也门局势和红海局势同加沙冲突密切相关。加沙迟迟难以实现停火，负面外溢效应加剧地区动荡。中方敦促尽快落实安理会第2712号、2720号、2728号和2735号决议，立即实现加沙持久停火，推动包括也门和红海在内的地区紧张局势早日降温。中方愿继续同国际社会一道，为政治解决也门问题，恢复地区和平稳定，实现中东长治久安做出努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and OCHA Director Dalton, for your informative briefings. Colleagues, last year there was hope for a breakthrough in the long-stalled diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the conflict in Yemen. This was a moment of optimism after years and years of war, after so much devastation and suffering. Unfortunately, peace has thus far proven elusive, and the Yemeni people continue to pay a heavy, heavy price. Today, I want to focus on 3 ways the Houthis are undermining peace and security in Yemen and across the region and the world. First, the Houthis continue to unjustly detain humanitarian and diplomatic personnel. Just a few weeks ago, a chorus of council members demanded the immediate and safe release of these detainees, including in your statements today. 130 Yemeni staff from approximately 29 different organizations who were working to bring life-saving assistance to the Yemeni people at the time of their detention. But the Houthis have not freed these detainees, and in fact, have only ramped up attacks on humanitarians, as we heard today from both of our briefers. Houthi rebels raided the headquarters of UN's Human Rights Office in Sana'a, and this must be roundly condemned. There's absolutely no justification for targeting UN workers and detaining persons for carrying out their lawful humanitarian and diplomatic work in this conflict and in any other conflict. And in fact, it is important that we here in the Council not give justification for the situation in Yemen because things are happening elsewhere in the world. Colleagues, we have also received credible reports that the Houthis continue to seriously abuse and mistreat the detainees, including U.S. diplomatic staff members that have been held since 2021. Reports also indicate that Houthi officials have warned families of the detained against speaking out publicly, so the actual number of detainees may be significantly higher. Today, I want to recognize the brave voices of Yemeni civil society organizations that are advocating for the immediate and unconditional release of all unjustly detained persons. This Council must lend our support to those efforts. We must speak with one voice to condemn the Houthis' detention of the UN and other personnel and demand their immediate unconditional release. The second issue I want to raise is the dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which has been exacerbated by the Houthis' obstruction of critical aid and failed record of governance. As just one example, the Houthis are standing in the way of efforts to combat the spread of cholera in Yemen. The Houthis' denial of basic medical care has killed hundreds of people since October. This was a preventable tragedy. These are preventable deaths. Collaboration between the Republic of Yemen government and international organizations on vaccination campaigns contrasts sharply with Houthi obstruction, and in some instances, outright prohibition of ongoing vaccination efforts, which has led to a spike in polio and other preventable diseases in Houthi-controlled areas. Our message to the Houthis is simple. Stop obstructing aid and stop hindering humanitarian efforts. Lives hang in the balance. Colleagues, the Houthis are deliberately trying to distract from their failed record by focusing on other events in the region. We should not allow ourselves to fall into this trap. But the Yemeni people know better, and members of this council should stop making excuses for the Houthis. The United States, again, calls on all council members to unequivocally condemn the Houthis' continued escalatory attacks in the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and surrounding waterways. These attacks continue despite this council's demand in Resolution 2722 for the Houthis to, quote, cease all such attacks. These escalatory actions are a grave threat to international navigational freedoms as well as regional peace and security, and they've driven up prices and caused delays in the delivery of critical humanitarian items, such as food and medicines to Yemenis. And make no mistake, Iran has directly enabled these attacks. The Houthis' use of an Iranian Samad-3 drone in the July 19th attack on Israel was yet another example of Iranian-supplied weapons enabling deadly terrorist attacks in the region. The Houthis have expanded their ties to other Iranian-backed terrorist organizations in the region, and in an effort to further sow chaos in Yemen and across the Middle East. We emphasized this last month, and let me repeat it now. The only appropriate response is to condemn these attacks and demand that they stop immediately and without preconditions. Additionally, it is high time this council did something about Houthi attacks and activities. To start, we should take steps to deny them the weapons and supplies, particularly the critical material they have long received from Iran in contravention of the UN arms embargo established in Resolution 2216. Recently, the Yemeni permanent representative requested additional support in enforcing Resolution 2216. We should heed his call. Let's be clear, member states that stand in the way of holding the Houthis and Iran to account are complicit in undermining the credibility of the Council's resolution. As for our part, the United States will continue to support Israel's right to self-defense in the face of these unprecedented attacks. Colleagues, just because peace has proven elusive and just because this moment is marked by Houthi escalation does not mean that we give in to cynicism, or worse, let this conflict slide down the Council's agenda. That would be a grave injustice to the Yemeni people and to our mandate to maintain international peace and security. And so we must continue to call out the escalatory actions of the Houthis, and we must continue to call on all parties to work toward peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, President. I would like to extend my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grunberg and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for the informative updates. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Yemen to this meeting. President, while the international community monitors the volatile situation in the Middle East with grave concern, it is regrettable that we have not seen any significant progress on the ground in Yemen. Instead, we're witnessing ongoing Houthi attacks on vessels, including the 13 August attack on a Liberian-flagged oil tanker in the Red Sea, the incommunicado detention of personnel, including UN staff, and a continuous humanitarian crisis. Against this dire backdrop, I would like to address the following points. First, the Republic of Korea strongly calls on the Houthis to immediately cease all illegal ongoing attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the broader region. These reckless and hostile activities will only undercut the arduous efforts toward a peaceful settlement for all of the Yemeni people. Furthermore, we urge the Houthis to refrain from any further provocative actions that could exacerbate the uncertain regional security situation in the upcoming days and weeks. Second, we resolutely condemn the Houthi storming of the UN Human Rights Office in Sana'a and the seizure of documents and property by force. This alarming incident is even more concerning given the Houthis' enforced disappearance and continued detention of UN, diplomatic, civil society, and private sector personnel. The Republic of Korea, with its unwavering support for the international community's efforts to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people, appeals to Houthis to release all detainees immediately and unconditionally, and to fully cooperate with the global community to realize a brighter future for the Yemeni people. Third, the Republic of Korea expresses grave concerns over the humanitarian situation on the ground. Recent devastating floods have claimed dozens of lives and impacted a huge number of families, significantly increasing humanitarian needs. Additionally, the spread of cholera continues to pose a serious threat to communities, and heightened food insecurity and hunger remain major concerns. We are of the view that the international community must refocus its sustained attention on the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen. As my delegation stated several times, we are committed to continuing our active contributions to support humanitarian needs in close cooperation with all relevant stakeholders. Fourth, we greatly hope that the Yemeni government and the Houthis will faithfully implement their commitments to de-escalate ongoing economic conflicts for the greater good. Returning to tit-for-tat escalation, especially through hostile economic measures by the Houthis, will only inflict undue suffering on the innocent Yemeni people, disproportionately affecting women and children. Under this backdrop, we reaffirm our unflinching support for Special Envoy Grunberg's steadfast efforts in tackling these multiple ongoing challenges and laying the groundwork for an inclusive Yemeni-led political transition under UN auspices through his continuous engagement on the ground. We also hope that all Yemeni parties, particularly the Houthis, will respond to such endeavors and commit to a genuine negotiation process to pave way for a better future for all the Yemen and its people. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Sierra Leone. I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Mozambique, and my own country, Sierra Leone. We would like to express our sympathy to the government of Yemen and the families of those who lost their lives during the Hodeidah flooding on 8 August 2024, and the large number of persons that have been displaced as a result of this. We wish to express our gratitude and thanks to the briefers, Special Envoy Grunberg, and OCHA Director of Financing and Partnerships, Lisa Doughton. Your analytical clarity and oversight have deepened our understanding of the current situation in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of Yemen in this meeting. At the outset, members of the A3 are gravely concerned that the Houthis have once again escalated their attacks on United Nations premises. The deliberate, unjustifiable, an unacceptable seizure of the UN Human Rights Office on 3rd August 2024 by the Houthis is not only a brazen violation of international law and the Convention on the Safety of United Nations and associated personnel, but also the Charter of the United Nations. Such actions undermine the integrity of international operations and represent a direct assault on the principles of neutrality and impartiality that govern the work of the United Nations. Operations of the United Nations are conducted in the common interest of the international community and in line with the principles and purposes enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. The premises of the United Nations should never be a target of attack, nor its employees. We add our voice to the Special Envoy and that of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, in asking the Houthis to leave the UN premises and to return all belongings of United Nations personnel immediately. The sanctity of UN facilities must be respected, and any form of aggression against the staff is unacceptable. We are also gravely concerned that the scores of detained staff of the UN and other international organizations have still not been released, and access has not been granted to their families. The refusal to release these individuals and to allow them access to their families constitutes a serious breach of international law. These actions not only undermine regional and UN efforts for peace, but also exacerbate the already dire humanitarian situation in Yemen. The continued detention of aid workers and UN staff is a setback to the progress made towards a peaceful resolution and a betrayal of the humanitarian principles that guide international interventions. After nearly a decade of conflict and humanitarian crisis, millions of Yemenis have been displaced and are facing starvation. The increase in food consumption and food deprivation levels are worrying, and it is our hope that the WFP can resume its food distribution soonest. We call on all parties to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, to ensure the provision of humanitarian assistance to the Yemeni people. The reality is that poverty has deepened. The people of Yemen cannot afford a renewed conflict. Colleagues, to this end, we'd like to make 4 key points. Firstly, we reiterate our strong support for UN and regional efforts towards a Yemeni-owned and led political settlement and all actors to prioritize diplomatic channels. There's an urgency in working towards reestablishing the truce that was in place prior to the recent escalation in the Israel-Gaza conflict. This will involve an integrated approach and a genuine compromise among the different actors through diplomatic efforts under the leadership of the United Nations, and other efforts by regional countries must remain at the forefront of this process. It will also involve increased efforts to secure a ceasefire. In this regard, we commend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman for their unrelenting efforts towards a peaceful settlement of the Yemeni conflict. We must safeguard progress that has been made through diplomacy. Continuing military confrontation can only fuel the conflict with the risk of increased civilian suffering. The A3+ also commends the Office of the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen and UN Women Yemen for their recent consultative meeting in Mukalla, which brought together 70 representatives from different parts of Yemeni society, including government officials, civil society leaders, and political representatives, which aim to develop a bottom-up vision for the inclusive process, focused on key priorities such as economic and security measures, humanitarian needs, and the escalation strategies. A significant outcome was the unanimous agreement on the vital role of women in political and economic dialogues, highlighting the importance of their full participation in achieving sustainable peace. Second, we call for an end to the ongoing violation and attacks on UN premises and for the immediate and unconditional release of all detainees. It is regrettable that following talks in Muscat on the release of all detainees, the Houthis have taken the path of undermining the progress achieved in Oman. Personnel of the United Nations are deployed to provide comprehensive support in facilitating the conduct and fulfillment of the mandate of the United Nations, and they are not a party to any conflict. The continuous attacks on UN premises and UN personnel are an attempt to extinguish the tiny amount of hope that is left in the Houthi control areas. This is also a strategy to finally put to rest any thought of dissent in their areas of operations. The international community should ensure the Houthis are denied opportunities to affirm themselves. Third, we urge the Houthis to cease their maritime attacks in the Red Sea. The recent report of the Secretary General has highlighted a disturbing increase in such incidents, which not only threaten regional stability, but also diminish the prospects for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The success of these attacks has given the Houthis a broad flexibility to maneuver easily in the region and in Yemen, but it is also diminishing hopes for diplomatic efforts to be successful. This continued affront in the Red Sea has led to the suspension of a much anticipated peace following almost 2 years of calm. The gains made so far have been reversed, and everything is at a standstill. Conversely, while we urge the Houthis to cease all maritime attacks, we urge countries with influence not to fan the flames of military standoff in the Red Sea, and therefore support efforts to bring peace in Yemen and support the economic prosperity of Yemenis. In this connection, the members of the A3+ re-emphasize the urgency of a ceasefire in Gaza and the swift implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2735 as it remains key to the stability of the Middle East. Fourth, we urge donor countries to support the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan. The current reality just described by Mr. Rajasingham Adair, the lack of funding for the Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan is a source of concern and requires efforts to be scaled up, especially with an imminent threat of a regional war. For millions of Yemenis, particularly children, their most pressing issues are their daily sustenance and the resumption of economic activities. To conclude, the members of the A3+ will remain steadfast in our efforts leading to a peaceful and stable Yemen. We are committed to working alongside the United Nations and regional partners to ensure the return of normalcy to the country following years of conflict and instability. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
اسمح لي في البداية السيد الرئيس أن أتقدم إليكم بالتهنئة على رئاستكم للمجلس لهذا الشهر، متمنيا لكم كل التوفيق والنجاح، وأتقدم بالشكر لسلفكم روسيا الاتحادية الصديقة على رئاستها للمجلس في الشهر الماضي. أشكر السيد هانس جروندبرغ والسيدة ليزا داوتن على إحاطتهما. السيد الرئيس، يقف اليمن اليوم على أعتاب مرحلة خطيرة وصعبة بعد 10 سنوات من انقلاب الميليشيات الحوثية الإرهابية وحربها على الدولة اليمنية والتوافق الوطني وتطلعات الشعب اليمني في الاستقرار والأمن والبناء والتنمية. هذه الحرب التي خلفت وضعا اقتصاديا وإنسانيا كارثيا، وعلى الرغم من كل الجهود الإقليمية والدولية لإنهاء هذا الصراع وتحقيق السلام، وعلى وجه التحديد جهود الأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية وسلطنة عمان لمعالجة الأزمة اليمنية، إلا أن الميليشيات الحوثية تتجه نحو العودة مجددا إلى مربع الحرب من خلال التصعيد العسكري على عدة محافظات واعتداءاتها على مئات القرى والعزل في مختلف المناطق الخاضعة لسيطرتها بالقوة، وصعدت جرائمها وانتهاكاتها بحق المدنيين من قتل وتهجيرا وتفجيرا للمنازل في محاولة لكسر إرادة اليمنيين وإخضاعهم لمشروعها الانقلابي وأفكارها المتطرفة وحربها الاقتصادية الممنهجة ضد الحكومة اليمنية والشعب اليمني وتهديد حركة الملاحة الدولية في البحر الأحمر ومضيق باب المندب، وتعريض السلم والأمن الإقليمي والدولي للخطر، وإصرار هذه الميليشيات على إطالة أمد الصراع الذي من شأنه مضاعفة المعاناة الإنسانية وإجهاض الجهود الإقليمية والدولية لإنهاء هذه الحرب واستعادة مسار السلام. وعملا بمبدأ المرونة ودعمها المتواصل للجهود والمساعي الإقليمية والدولية لإنهاء هذا الصراع، تؤكد الحكومة اليمنية مجددا على حرصها عدم تعريض أبناء الشعب اليمني في المناطق الخاضعة لسيطرة الميليشيات الحوثية إلى المزيد من الأعباء المعيشية جراء سياسات أحادية الجانب من قبل هذه الميليشيات، والتخفيف من معاناتهم الإنسانية ووطأة هذه الحرب. في هذا السياق تدعو حكومة بلادي هذا المجلس الموقر والمجتمع الدولي إلى تحمل مسؤولياته في مواصلة المزيد من الضغوط على هذه الميليشيات ودفعها إلى تغليب مصالح الشعب اليمني وعدم رهنها بمصالح داعميها، وجر اليمن وشعبه من حرب إلى أخرى، والشروع بدلا عن ذلك في الاستجابة لجهود السلام التي يقودها الأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية من أجل إطلاق عملية سياسية تلبي تطلعات جميع اليمنيين في استعادة مؤسسات الدولة الضامنة للحقوق والحريات والمواطنة المتساوية وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار والتنمية وفقا لمرجعيات الحل السياسي المتفق عليها، وهي المبادرة الخليجية وآليتها التنفيذية ومخرجات مؤتمر الحوار الوطني الشامل وقرارات هذا المجلس ذات الصلة. وفي المقدمة القرار 2216 الذي يشكل خارطة الطريق لمعالجة الأزمة اليمنية. السيد الرئيس، يتعرض العمل الإنساني والإغاثي في مناطق سيطرة الميليشيات الحوثية إلى المزيد من الانتهاكات والعراقيل، بما في ذلك قيام هذه الميليشيات على إجبار المنظمات الدولية ووكالات الأمم المتحدة في مناطق سيطرتها على أخذ موافقتها المسبقة عند توظيف أي موظف محلي أو أجنبي، وتسليمها الهياكل الوظيفية لكل منظمة، ومنع موظفيها من مغادرة البلاد، وإقدام هذه الميليشيات مؤخرا على اقتحام مقر المفوضية السامية للأمم المتحدة لحقوق الإنسان في صنعاء وإغلاقه ومصادرة محتوياته. وتأتي هذه الخطوة استمرارا لنهج هذه الميليشيات في الضغط على تلك المنظمات والوكالات الأممية لإحكام السيطرة عليها وتسخير أنشطتها لخدمة أهدافها. ويأسفنا القول أنه بعد مضي أكثر من شهرين على احتجاز العشرات من موظفي المنظمات الدولية والمحلية ووكالات الأمم المتحدة العاملة في اليمن والمواقف الدولية المترددة قد شجع هذه الميليشيات على المضي قدما في انتهاكاتها وجرائمها بحق العاملين في هذه المنظمات والوكالات الأممية دون أي اكتراث بالآثار الكارثية لتلك الممارسات على الأوضاع الاقتصادية والإنسانية الصعبة في مناطق سيطرة هذه الميليشيات. وتدعو الحكومة اليمنية مجددا إلى نقل كل مقرات المنظمات الدولية ووكالات الأمم المتحدة العاملة في اليمن إلى العاصمة المؤقتة عدن، وقد حان الوقت لاتخاذ مثل هذه الخطوة الهامة حفاظا على سلامة العمل الإنساني وأرواح العاملين في هذا المجال وضمان المناخ الملائم لممارسة المهام الإنسانية وتقديم المساعدات الإنسانية إلى كافة الفئات المحتاجة دون تمييز ودون تعرضها للخطر. السيد الرئيس، تعرضت عدد من المحافظات ومنها مدينة الحديدة لأمطار غزيرة وسيول جارفة أدت إلى أضرار جسيمة في البنى التحتية ودمارا هائلا في الممتلكات العامة والخاصة، وسقوط العشرات من المواطنين ضحايا وتشريد السكان بعضهم من النازحين داخليا وتوقف الخدمات العامة. وتدعو الحكومة اليمنية جميع الشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين من المؤسسات المالية والمنظمات الدولية والإنسانية إلى دعم جهودها في مواجهة هذه الأضرار والكارثة التي تفوق قدرات الحكومة والسلطات المحلية في المناطق المنكوبة، وتقديم الدعم العاجل وبكافة إشكاله لإنقاذ المتضررين وتأهيل البنى التحتية. إن تراكم آثار الحرب والكوارث المرتبطة بالتغير المناخي أدى إلى تفاقم الأوضاع الإنسانية في اليمن، مما يجعل عملية التعافي التي تقودها الحكومة أكثر صعوبة، وهناك حاجة إلى اتخاذ إجراءات عاجلة لتلبية الاحتياجات الإنسانية الطارئة في المدن المتضررة، لا سيما بعد أن أعلنت الحكومة اليمنية مدينة الحديدة منطقة منكوبة، ومعالجة الآثار طويلة الأجل لتغير المناخ والحد من المخاطر المتزايدة للكوارث المناخية التي تهدد البلاد. وفي هذا الإطار نشيد بالاستجابة الإغاثية العاجلة من قبل الأشقاء في المملكة العربية السعودية عبر مركز الملك سلمان للإغاثة والأعمال الإنسانية وتدخلاته الإغاثية للتخفيف من معاناة المواطنين في المناطق المتضررة. السيد الرئيس، تعمل الحكومة اليمنية على اتخاذ جملة من الإجراءات الهادفة إلى رفع المعاناة على كاهل الشعب اليمني والتخفيف من الآثار والعواقب الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والإنسانية الكارثية، ووقف التدهور الاقتصادي واستقرار الخدمات العامة في ظل تحديات كبيرة متمثلة في توقف تصدير النفط لأكثر من عامين، الذي يشكل نسبة 70% من إجمالي الموارد العامة للدولة، بسبب استهداف الميليشيات الحوثية لموانئ تصدير النفط وحرمان الشعب اليمني من أهم موارده. وتأتي هذه الجهود من خلال وضع خطط استراتيجية للحكومة وتحديد أولوياتها في إيجاد حلول مستدامة على المستويين الخدمي والتنموي، وخلق شراكات إقليمية ودولية. بالإضافة إلى ذلك يستمر العمل بوتيرة عالية لتعزيز الشفافية والمساءلة ومكافحة الفساد وتنفيذ الإصلاحات الاقتصادية والمالية والإدارية كعنوان رئيسي للمرحلة الحالية. السيد الرئيس، في ضوء الصورة القاتمة للوضع الإنساني الراهن في اليمن، وفي ظل الفجوة التمويلية الهائلة لخطة الاستجابة الإنسانية للعام 2024، أدى تراجع التمويل الدولي للعمليات الإنسانية في اليمن إلى آثار كارثية على شتى القطاعات، لا سيما القطاع الصحي، حيث أنه من المتوقع إغلاق أكثر من 1000 مرفق صحي وتعريض حياة ما يزيد عن 500,000 امرأة إلى مخاطر الوفاة، وحرمان 600,000 طفل من خدمات التطعيم والرعاية الصحية، بالإضافة إلى ضعف القدرة على مواجهة تفشي العديد من الأمراض الوبائية. ونجدد الدعوة لجميع الدول الشقيقة والصديقة والمنظمات الدولية المانحة لدعم خطة الاستجابة الإنسانية بالشكل الذي يفي بحجم الاحتياجات الإنسانية القائمة في مختلف القطاعات، وندعو الأمم المتحدة والمجتمع الدولي لإبقاء الوضع الإنساني في اليمن على قائمة أولوياته لتجاوز الظروف الراهنة وتفادي الكارثة الإنسانية المحتملة. ختاما، السيد الرئيس، ندعو المجتمع الدولي إلى تقديم كافة أشكال الدعم لليمن لإحلال السلام الشامل والمستدام لاستعادة مؤسسات الدولة والتغلب على الأوضاع الإنسانية والاقتصادية المتفاقمة. شكرا للسيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Yemen for their statements. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.